and social work professionals for continuing education credit hours, and she has presented psychological first aid and resiliency training to thousands of responders, safety managers, military public health officials, and other private and public sector lay personnel across the United States and internationally, and we have her here. So we're so delighted. Thank you, Dr. Smith, and we look forward to your presentation tonight. Please join me in welcoming
Test. There we go. Thank you so very much, everyone, for being here, and for those of you who are with us online. Before we get started this evening, I'd like for us to just take a moment to go inward, connect with God, your spirituality, and whatever way you conceive, perceive of it, and also to, with me, honor our brothers and sisters in California, Las Vegas, Mexico, Texas, along the Gulf Coast, the Keys, throughout the rest of Florida, Puerto Rico, throughout the Caribbean. It has been an incredibly difficult season, if that's what we're going to call it. And let's just take a moment to remember that out of the wake of disaster comes the opportunity for new growth and a greater connection with all that is and all that is meant to be. If you'll join me for just a moment, please, in a moment of silence for our brothers and sisters. And of course, we pray for their resilience and their blessings as they recover. Thank you. So, as we get started this evening and we talk about the recovery and resilience in the wake of disaster, I wanted to share with you, is the volume loud enough now? Are we doing better? Okay. And I wanted to share with you that when I first started this work in 2005, there was this definition of disaster that was floating around out there. And notice, yes, an encounter between forces of harm and human population in harm's way, creating demand that exceeds the coping capacity of individuals and affected community. Now that was 12 years ago that I began this work, and in the 12 years that I've been doing it, I have seen been on the ground for numerous disasters of various sizes, and I take exception to the latter part of this definition, because in the worst of the worst situations, maybe momentarily, the coping capacity of individuals and communities has been exceeded, but really what has been happening in the immediate term and over the long term is that the coping capacities have been stressed. That's a really important thing to realize, both on the individual and the community level, because for those of you who attended the cancer presentation I did a couple of months ago, you may remember this little guy in just a moment who's coming up, and we'll talk about what that stress looks like on the individual level, and then you take that community-wide. But first, let's take a look at a really important model that I was introduced to when I first started this work. And in this, you will see a couple of really important things that might not be that obvious when just looking at the model of disaster phases. First of all, this line right here, the pre-disaster phase, is telling us that overall, individuals, communities have levels of function and coping that are fairly well established, pretty set. Nothing in nature moves in a straight line, so it's kind of more like that. But it's a fairly stable functional capacity, functional ability, level of existence. Then whatever happens creates the hit. We take the hit. The impact phase occurs. And of course, that would be during the time when individual and community coping capacities might feel exceeded. And certainly that is when the big part of the stressor hits. Although for those of you who have been in Florida during even one hurricane season, you know that that stress can start leading into the potential for us to take that hit. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Then this amazing thing happens where out of the wake in the midst of the wake of disaster, we start to see, that little red light, if I can find it, there we go. We start to see this climb into maximum functional capacity, where communities, individuals begin displaying acts of heroism, where Pastor Megan, I think you talked about it in the service a couple of weeks ago, where people who never would have even spoken to each other before connect with each other, help each other. There's a community solidarity that develops. The eyes of the world are upon us. The eyes of the assistance from the world flows to whoever is being impacted at that time. And that is a time when the energy is at a maximum for most individuals and communities as well. And then something really important happens, like that the media turns its attention to, like what shoes Melania wore to Texas or something. Yeah, really important, right? Or, you know, what celebrities just married or divorced. And all of a sudden, media attention, world attention is gone at about the same time that this plummet into disillusionment begins. That plummet into disillusionment is not only about how people feel in the wake and the sort of stymied place that people may be for a time. It is also, as again we'll see in a moment with our little guy demonstrating the stress response, a time when very real physiological things occur in the body of individuals and thus throughout communities. It's also the time, though, when the reconstruction is getting started and when it is so important that we have, or a community has, the support from the others, wherever those others may be. But there's this thing that occurs where the support does kind of drop off in here, and maybe, certainly this year, because there's support needed elsewhere, but that's not always the case. The people who have been directly affected, though, are left to handle this phase on their own, typically, or feeling much less supported than in the immediate aftermath. And that is the time often when the support is needed the most. So, an amazing thing happens, though. Eventually, notice there aren't any set times along the bottom axis because it's different for each community, each situation. Eventually, though, the community rebuilds, individuals rebuild, and reach a point, it's possible to reach a point where that capacity exceeds even where they were at prior to the event. And that will be a major focus of what we're going to talk about tonight. That capacity to not just return to pre-event functioning, but to return bigger, better, stronger than ever before. So in the meantime, though, initially, we look something like this, if we could diagram it for ourselves, when we get hit with that stress response, or when that stress response is evoked due to what we're being hit with, I should say. If you look closely at this, you'll see that there is essentially no bodily system that is not impacted or can be impacted by the stress response. This is our body on stress. Now, that's different. Different people feel it in different parts of their bodies because of their own vulnerabilities, but it's a very real physiological phenomenon that occurs, and particularly during that disillusionment phase where the effects of having gone through all of this start to catch up with us on both a bodily and a psychological or emotional level. Again, just at the time when we really need to dig in and begin that reconstruction, that rebuilding. Our bodies, our minds, our morale, it can be a number of different things, are really feeling the hit. It's important to realize this because we've got to be very careful about how we care for ourselves during those times. So, as I had alluded to earlier, we know that this stress response can begin before we even get into the immediacy, the actuality of a disaster that we call back here hurricanes typically. We know that when they tell us it's now hurricane season, there's in many people that trigger that fires off that starts to say, okay, I got to start getting ready, or what do I do? Some people freeze then. I don't want to think about it. It's not going to happen maybe. There are any number of ways to respond to this, but it all, in one way or another, can affect throughout the entire being. And to be aware of that is really important. Not to be overwhelmed by it, but if we're aware of it, then we can begin to do something about it. So, given that this is what's happening physically, let me ask you, and particularly this year, over and over, right? We've had many times when we've had to keep our eyes open and where that stress response is likely to have been fired off in one way or another. So let me ask you what you've seen or heard, possibly, just to think about what you've maybe seen or heard on the news when, from different places, different reporters. Now, I'm not saying this young lady was one that I saw actually do it, but it was someone who looked kind of like her. She was communicating with a reporter out in the field in one of the Caribbean locations that was first hit. I think it was St. Thomas, the young woman I saw talking to the reporter there. And she asked him, or said to him, tell me about the resilient responses you've seen after he had been talking about the devastation he was seeing, how difficult it appeared for people there. Well, tell me about the resilient responses you've seen. To which he replied, well, no one is crying, and people are bouncing back. Now, the implication of that is actually very serious because and in this resilience movement that I've become a part of, there is this sort of notion that's out there that people bounce back. But as resilient and competent as individual survivors and communities are, we're not bouncing balls. We don't bounce back. Over time, if the ball bounces far enough and long enough, yes, but not in that immediate time frame that seems to be assumed and expected by a lot of people. So just because someone, the other thing that really concerned me is just because someone is showing emotion in the immediate aftermath of disaster or trauma or in response to any stressor essentially, down the line or at any time, it doesn't mean they're not strong. It doesn't mean they're not resilient. I know there may even be people here who disagree with that because of the way we've been taught to think that if emotion is there, we're breaking down or something. But breaking and showing emotion are two very different things. So, given what I've said so far, take a moment and just ask yourself, well then how should people respond to disasters or other major stressors? What is a normal response to disaster or other trauma? Take a minute and think about it. But I'll give you a little hint. There isn't one. There's no one right, normal, strong, resilient way to react or respond. In fact, in the wake of major trauma, one can expect to see just about any response. From the ones you see here, disbelief, denial, fear, sadness, overwhelm, anger, or just numbing out, to maybe crying and screaming, or angry outbursts that make this little reference to anger earlier look minimal, paralysis or withdrawal, physical symptoms of stress, which are very normal, by the way, following, are very expected in a lot of people following critical incidents. Maybe jumpiness, hypervigilance, feeling like you have to be constantly scanning the environment, avoidance of certain situations or stimuli, sleep disruption. Some people turn to alcohol and drugs. Hyperfocus on a cognitive level or utter confusion. Distraction, aimless wandering, and you can see them, I'll read them for the people who are watching online. Total shutdown, taking charge, or no apparent response. Just some people seem like they haven't been affected at all. Seem like they haven't been affected at all. So a normal response, essentially any response in the wake of major trauma, critical incident, disaster, however you want to refer to it, is a normal response. Very important to understand. And so what is resilience? Resilience is not a bouncing ball. It's a process that we can do many things to facilitate if we view it as that. And so one of the, well, actually the approach that I'll be sharing with you is the best practices recommended approach for people like myself who deliver emergency care in the wake of disaster and trauma. It's referred to as psychological first aid. So the things I'm going to be sharing with you this evening come right out of psychological first aid and how it is applied one-on-one, in small groups, larger groups. It's been recommended since the early 2000s. It is evidence-informed, which means that there is still research taking place in order to make it empirically validated. That's a statistical difference that's called out in the scientific literature. So evidence-informed, based on the best evidence we have thus far, it's drawing upon various aspects of psychological research. And as I said, that's the basis for this presentation. So I started with one of the first tenets of it. Why did I talk about what's normal? Well, because recognizing normalcy, the normalcy of virtually any response in the wake of major trauma, is hugely important. And why is it important? Well, because each person does have their own response set. It's critical to accept that each of us will experience various aspects of the same situation, traumatic or not, differently. And to not judge ourselves or others based on our response. Why is it important to not judge ourselves and to understand that essentially any response is normal? Because those expectations about ourselves and others, if we or they don't meet them, with regard to what's normal or right or strong, adds more pressure to an already pressurized situation and can actually impede recovery and resilience. It can make the process a lot harder than if we are kind, accepting, and tender with ourselves and others, understanding that what they're going through or what we're going through is, again, normal, within the range of normal, following the situation we've been exposed to. Summed up in a phrase that I think captures it very well, which says they're normal responses to an abnormal situation.